Good morning, everybody. Very nice of you to join me. This was also meant to be topical because when Tim asked me to come and give this talk, it was literally on the eve of the COVID epidemic. And I thought it would be fun to have something that sort of led into the next big V&A, would have been blockbuster, which is on Alice in Wonderland. It's scheduled to open in March, but I do not know, obviously, if that's going to happen. And this is not the first time that a major institution has tried to focus on Alice. Back in around about 2011, somewhere around about there, Tate Liverpool did a joint exhibition with an institution in Germany, because Alice has enormous popularity right the way across the world, including Japan. So that's the reason why I thought Alice to Lord of the Rings would be appropriate, because of course I have to say that I'm not an expert on the Lord of the Rings. You're probably going to know it much more, if you're into Lord of the Rings, that is, much better than me. I was always a Narnia girl, so I apologise if I don't necessarily know the entire plot of Lord of the Rings. Anyway, so I'm starting off with one of my favourite images of Alice, where she's holding a flamingo and is about to attempt to play croquet with said flamingo. And this, of course, is by John Tenniel, who was his images for Alice are essentially iconic. And much the same way now, really, for Lord of the Rings. I mean, if you Google Alan Lee, it'll basically say he is the creator of Middle Earth. That's one of the most famous articles about him in the Telegraph. Okay, so the V&A exhibition, when it happens, is simply entitled Alice Curiouser and a Curiouser. And it's supposed to sort of cover the entire gamut, the way in which Alice has affected popular culture, fashion. So, I looked at some of the previews, and I think we're going to find that, in fact, the role of the illustrated book will be relatively marginal in what appears to be something that's very focused, really, on fashion. But I'm going to start at the beginning of the story with the fact that Lewis Carroll, aka Mr. Dodgson, that's his real name, actually illustrated the very first issue, or the very first manuscript, I should say, of Alice's Adventures Underground. So it was originally called Alice's Adventures Underground, and only became Alice's Adventures in Wonderland when it was first published in 1865 with illustrations by John Tenniel. So on the left-hand side, we've got the original manuscript that Lewis Carroll gave to Alice Liddell. As you know, there's a sort of local connection because Alice Liddell, when she marries and becomes a sort of grande dame, becomes sort of one of the local families in Lyndhurst. So if you want to go in search of Mrs. Hargreaves, as she becomes, that's Alice Liddell, you'll find her buried round the back of the beautiful St. Michael and All Angels in Lyndhurst, of all places. And there's a monument within the church to the Hargreaves family, which is by George Edmund Street. Hopefully, when all of this is over, we can get back to exploring not just the wider world, but even our own beautiful countryside. So it was Alice who was out boating with Lewis Carroll, with her three sisters all together. And it was Alice who actually asked Lewis Carroll to write the story down. And it's a bit like studying Shakespeare. People study all the different versions of it before the final version was published in 1865. It got bigger, episodes were added, and then eventually there was a sequel, as we'll see. So sometimes the elements in it that you think are, that are Alice, in Wonderland, actually turn out to be Alice through the looking glass. So we'll come to that in a minute. But this, on the left-hand side, as I said, is the original illustrated manuscript that Charles Dickens planned for Alice Liddell, and then the Drink Me, famous image of Alice before she drinks that potion that changes her size, by Tenniel, is on the right-hand side. And I've got to know Tenniel very well, largely because he was one of the most important cartoonists for Punch. So like many illustrators, he was multifaceted in terms of the publications for which he worked, but he is primarily an illustrator. So here are the eaglet, the lorry, the duck, and the dodo. The lorry is the parrot, and you can actually see the lorry, maybe my cursor works. He's just above the duck. Here's the duck, there's the parrot. And in the version by Arthur Rackham, the poet, the parrot, the lorry, is just over here. You can just pick out his red markings. So rather than showing you Rackham's illustrations after Tenniel's, I've sort of mashed them together. So you can see that, in fact, Rackham, Arthur Rackham, the famous illustrator of the so-called golden age of book illustration, that in fact he follows Tenniel's images pretty closely in many respects. Though I do love these otters in the version by Arthur Rackham. So the lorry is based on Lorena Charlotte Liddell, who is Alice's older sister. And the idea is that she has power over the younger siblings. So that's the reason why she's the lorry, the parrot. Queen Victoria had a lorry as well. So perhaps it gives you some idea of how autocratic this type of parrot was said to be. The eaglet was Edith Liddell, and the duck, who you see here, right in the forefront, in fact, of the Rackham, was a caricature of the Reverend Robinson Duckworth, who was one of the party that went boating on the Thames with the three girls. And the dodo is a pun on the real name of Charles Dodgson Lewis Carroll. He changed his name because he was a professor of mathematics. So when I say he changed his name, he had a pseudonym, so that when he was sort of publishing serious stuff, it would be under his, you know, his real name. And then Lewis Carroll is his nom de plume. So the boating incident, or the boating events, took place in 1862. So it's a good 3 years, in fact, until the book is actually published. Okay, so 1865 and 1907 for the Arthur Rackham. So again, I've put the two side by side for you. Tenniel's image of the White Rabbit certainly has become iconic. He's sort of dressed rather like a sort of slightly spivvy city gent with his checked jacket. So I can see here that he's, you know, looking at his watch. And on the Rackham side, he's made him slightly more dandified, hasn't he? With frilly cuffs and a sort of cravat. But in fact, the imagery between the two illustrators is actually rather similar. So the mock turtle and the griffin sing to Alice. So again, I've put the Tenniel and the Rackham side by side. It's a good 50 years between them, but as you can see, they are still pretty much, well, in fact, Rackham is very much following what you might call a Tenniel tradition. And you can see it's dated down the bottom, Arthur Rackham, 1907, that is. So I love the way that the mock turtle is a lament. When he says he's singing, I mean, it's not a happy song, as you can see. You can also see that Rackham has got up a chart for rather sinister trees. We saw here one in the background of Rackham. So here we have another iconic figure from the story. This is Alice Speaks to the Cheshire Cat. Now, Rackham's cat is actually quite different, as you can see. It's perhaps quite so manic. I've always thought that the Cheshire Cat, a la Tenniel, looks like he's been on LSD from the size of his eyes. And then there was an episode in the story where they discuss decapitating the cat. I'm pleased to say I don't think that actually happened, but I don't think health and safety would let you do it now. But you can see that in the case of Rackham, he's really hidden the cat, hasn't he? It takes you a while. I'm showing you the cat's head here in the tree, and he's really hidden it in an incredibly spooky tree. Now, I'm not actually quite sure where Rackham got his trees from, but you're going to discover fairly soon that this is where the Ents come from. When you look at Alan Lee's drawings for the Ents in Lord of the Rings, they look remarkably like the trees originally conceived by Rackham. They're not happy trees, you know, they are the trees of nightmare. And we do know that Walt Disney, when he was planning the first full-scale animated cartoon, Snow White, that he basically told his principal cartoonist by the name of Pulteney that he wanted the trees to be like Arthur Rackham's, as he was obviously traumatized by them himself at a young age. Here we have the cook, the Duchess, the Cheshire Cat, the baby, and Alice in the kitchen. The Duchess doesn't appear in the first version as conceived by Lewis Carroll. She's one of the sort of later additions. And it's always said that the Duchess was based on a painting by Quentin Matisse, which is a very almost like Dürer-esque, as you can see, rendering of a grotesque old woman. There's been much discussion about what disease she might have been suffering from in the 16th century that led to her extremely unusual features. Now, this is now in the National Gallery, but it's all very well saying that Tenniel might have been influenced by it, but it didn't arrive in the National Gallery until after the Second World War. So I always, when people say things, oh yes, it was definitely based on the Quentin Matisse, I want to know how, you know, Tenniel actually saw it. But you can see that the headdress in particular, as well as her grumpy features, are very close to the Renaissance work of art. And then over in the kitchen, a la Rackham, as you can see, our Duchess is quite different, though I do love the cat in the background. There's a sort of slightly, she's got sort of like lovely ringlets here, hasn't she, and lots of feathers. And the idea with the Duchess, evidently, is that she's either above her station, you know, that she's married well, and she's now trying to sort of catch up and prove that she knows more than she does, and that also she's mutton dressed as lamb. And these are all elements that Lewis Carroll tried to bring into the story. Many people were cross when it was originally published, but it wasn't moralizing enough. I wonder if it was John Ruskin who had a moan about that. But certainly the Duchess rather makes up about for that, because she has all these one-liners that are sort of like, almost like, not quite limericks, but they're bon mots. And often they're sort of slightly satiric. You know, you get the impression that slightly tongue-in-cheek, well, more than slightly tongue-in-cheek, Lewis Carroll is implying that this idea of educating young people by spewing out these sort of one-liners, which were very moralizing, in fact, was not the way forward to a rounded education. So there are lots of hidden subtexts in Alice in Wonderland that you might not have realized are there. Probably the most famous episode of all is the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. And you can see that Tenniel's version and Rackham's version are again pretty close. We have Alice in a chair that's too big for her. And we have the coloured version of the Tenniel. I should just point out that all of the original Tenniels were black and white, and the colour is applied later. Sometimes it's a colour process, and called a chromoxylograph, which allowed you to print over an original copper or steel engraving, but the originals were all black and white. Of course, they're called Mad Hatters because they use mercury in the process of making hats. Yes, hence the fact that, you know, you licked your fingers and you, in the end, you ingested the poison. And it was actually well known, so it's all rather ironic. It's a bit like the story of having arsenic in wallpaper. Anyway, so there is a rather delightful tea party. And then off with her head. So again, I've put Alice a la Tenniel on one side and Rackham on the other. And you can see again that his queen with the pointing gesture, very, very similar. The Duchess and the Queen of Hearts are the two most vociferous and the two most unpleasant characters in the whole of the story. So they want to cut off the Cheshire Cat's head, now they want to cut off Alice's. Those are the hedgehogs in the Rackham that they've just been using for the croquet match. So you can see the flamingo as well being held in the background. And the final image, you're all just a pack of cards. Ala Tenniel and Ala Rackham are virtually identical, as you can see. And it's this idea that Alice, of course, wakes up to discover that really what she's been experiencing is either a dream, or many of us would argue, a nightmare. Victorian imagination was obviously extremely fertile. So there have been many illustrators of Alice. I'm just showing you here one because I love the border. So this is Bessie Pease Gutman. Not a very attractive name, is it? But the border is by Micklewright. I love the border. You can see the mouse and the white rabbit and the Mad Hatter and the frog and various other characters that have occurred. But I particularly want to point out here the caterpillar and his hooker. Now, interestingly enough, in the Betty Pease image, he's smoking a pipe. I love the way how in the Rackham he's smoking a hookah. Which again rather implies that there is a bit of drug taking behind the whole sort of character of Alice in Wonderland. I mean, that you have to remember that drug taking in the 19th century was very different to our attitudes now, that laudanum was taken for just about everything, that there were many addicted to opiates. The famous Sherlock Holmes character is supposed to be addicted to opiates. So the sort of slightly hallucinogenic elements that comes to my mind, in particular with Alice, because of the very famous 1970s, I think it is, song, which was all about taking LSD and going down the rabbit hole like Alice. Nice idea. So the sequel was 1871 and entitled Through the Looking Glass. And the idea now was that Alice would go rather like Narnia, and not through the back of a wardrobe, but through the mirror into another world on the other side. And of course, my theme this morning is very much other worlds, and other worlds which were created by contemporary Victorian writers. I'm not dealing here with Grimm, or the Grimm's brothers, though we will have some Hans Christian Andersen, because they, of course, were actually written in the mid-Victorian period. In fact, some were written as early as the 1830s. So some of the characters that you might think are in Alice in Wonderland are actually Through the Looking Glass: Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the Walrus and the Carpenter, and the Jabberwocky. And the Jabberwocky, courtesy of Tenniel, who had to be really persuaded to do Through the Looking Glass, by the way, is an interesting conflation. We know that Tenniel went to visit Crystal Palace at Sydenham, where they created an amazing garden full of dinosaurs. They weren't real, obviously, they were made out of concrete. And that was a spectacle that attracted many tourists. So we think that this sort of strange combination of raptor or Tyrannosaurus rex with those rather hideous bat-like wings have come out of Tenniel's imagination after a visit to Sydenham. And then we see Alice on the mantelpiece going through the mirror. So Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the two twins. And again, this was evidently partly inspired by the sort of whole nonsense of the era. I suppose at this point I should have put in Lear, Edward Lear, and his nonsense poems. But I just thought, if I'm not careful, I'm going to do too much. So my apologies to Edward Lear, who was best known for nonsense. But obviously, you know, the Jabberwocky elements and Tweedledum and Tweedledee undoubtedly bring the concepts of topsy-turvydom and nonsense into Alice's world. So my link here of looking at Tweedledee and Tweedledum is, of course, Peter Blake. So Peter Blake, after his pop art period, had a sort of mental breakdown, a sort of artistic life crisis. And he took himself off to Wellow, which was a little hamlet outside of Bath, to reinvent himself. by the middle of the 1970s, and this series is pre-ruralist, so these are often mistakenly described as ruralist works, but the ruralists don't come together until the late 70s, sort of 1976, 77. So these were actually conceived by Peter Blake and his then student Graham Ovenden in the very late 60s, when Graham was actually a student at the Royal College of Art. And then the two series were published around about 1970. So they sort of interconnect, as you'll see in a minute. This is Tweedledum in the, it's a print, obviously, which you'll find on the V&A website, series of screen prints, and it's all part of the sort of neo-Victorian revival that we have in the 1970s. But isn't it old, is what Dum is saying. And then on the other image, the Humpty Dumpty type image, we have the caption, and to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. So that's Peter Blake's reinvention of Alice. Graham's reinvention of Alice is somewhat different, because he's always, he's a great Alice expert, but he's also always seen the sort of darker side of Alice, that famous line, through a glass darkly, because I think he wants to emphasize that there is a sort of undercurrent in the Alice stories that is typically Victorian Gothic, if I can put it that way. So this is part of his sequence related to Alice. She's looking a bit broody, isn't she? A bit like a grumpy child. And then the poster, which is from one of the many Alice exhibitions that have travelled to Japan, is from 1991. It was organised by the Clifford Gallery, but you can see that the whole thing was designed for Tokyo. And there's Graham's Alice in the centre. He also produced, remember that in the late 60s, early 70s, we are very into psychedelia. In fact, one of the ways in which I discovered the Pre-Raphaelites was on the covers of the LPs that I bought. Artists like the Strawbs and the Grateful Dead, they reinvented the Victorians, and sort of like combined Victorian Pre-Raphaelite imagery with flower power. So this is a series of 8, known as the Rainbow Alice. And again, you could make sort of connections to drug taking if you wanted to. They're now very rare, and they were part of the exhibition at Tate Liverpool in 2011. And then this is Graham Arnold, who was part of the Ruralist Brotherhood. There were inevitably 7 of them. So the 2 Ovendens, the 2 Arnolds, and originally the 2 Blakes, because he was still married to Jan Horwath at this time. And David Inshaw, he made up the 7, but David hadn't married or even have a girlfriend, I think, at that point. So there were 7 in the Brotherhood of Ruralists. So here's Graham Arnold, and sadly Graham died in 2019, right when I was in the middle of curating my last Pre-Raphaelite exhibition, which was shown in Southampton and then went to the Russell Coate. So sadly, Graham Arnold is no longer with us, but this is his image of Alice. Graham was fascinated by memory, by memories of his own childhood, which accounts for that strange collection of objects behind Alice, who appears to be floating. And then from 1992, Alice balancing. And these images became very well known through prints. I'm not actually sure where the originals are now, my apologies. They are in private collections. So you can see what I mean about the sort of darker side of the imagery, that there is, you know, the Victorian psyche is complex, and their world of fantasy often has quite a dark, macabre element to it, hence the term Victorian Gothic. So another work that has very much taken our imagination is, well, combination. Christina Rossetti, who was Rossetti's sister, wrote Goblin Market, but the illustrations initially are by her brother. And the goblins, as you can see here, are actually quite attractive. You know, they're quite cute, aren't they? There's a cat, there's an owl, there's what again appears to be, I wonder whether one of his wombats made their way. You know, Rossetti was famous for his wombats. but we can certainly see a mouse in the background. So there's another parrot, that lorry. Perhaps that was an homage to Tenniel. But here are the two sisters. Now, there's Laura and Lizzie, they're good and bad sisters. And the frontispiece here, this is the only part of it, by the way, that was illustrated. So buy from us with a golden curl is this idea of seduction. So Goblin Market is really a sex poem. Let's be honest, let's put it right out there. It's really all about seduction. And at the end of the story, you know, the good sister rescues the bad sister, who is about to be led astray by the wondrous fruits of the goblins. So Golden Head by Golden Head are the two sisters. And essentially it's a dream that we're looking at. It's another dreamscape. And you can sort of see the goblins with their fruit in that moon shape in the background. My favourite illustrations, however, to Goblin Market are by Lawrence Hausman. And as you can see, he really brings out, again, the sort of macabre element. But he's taken Rossetti's characters. There's that lorry again, the parrot, and rats and moles, but given them a really sort of, you know, the whole thing is claustrophobic, isn't it? And you can see a rather manic expression on the face of the seduced young girl. You know, the Victorians are very hung up about sex. And believe it or not, Rackham's illustrations for Goblin Market actually made their way into Playboy, of all places. Again, perhaps emphasising that there's more to the story than people imagine. That again, Lucy is, you know, easily led astray by the fruits of the goblins. So we have some more obvious Rackham-like goblins in this image on the left-hand side. She's cutting off that curl of hair to get the tainted fruit. And then she's being overwhelmed with fruit on the right-hand side. And please note, being almost consumed by a Rackham-like tree. His trees are really spooky, and you'll see in a moment. Now, after Alice in Wonderland, the most popular writer of fairy stories is George MacDonald. He actually wrote many, and Graham is very generous with his collection. Graham began collecting these in the 60s. I can't afford any of these anymore, particularly the ones illustrated by Arthur Hughes. I was looking at one on the internet only yesterday thinking, oh, I really like that, until I saw that the price tag was $5,000. So here is The Light Princess, first published in 1864, and illustrated by Arthur Hughes. And they were not published in book form. Originally, they were published in magazines or in compilations. So originally, The Light Princess was in dealings with the fairies. And you might know it now as a musical. So it's a Sleeping Beauty story, because it starts off with the witch, who you see here with a rather fetching handbag, casting her spell. And basically she condemns the Light Princess to basically lose gravity. So she's always floating away. So I think the photograph, as you can see, of George MacDonald makes him look a bit like Rasputin. He's a real character. He has a very large family. He's always in debt. He's a bit of a bohemian. I think that's the best way to describe him. And he's very thick with all the pre-Raphaelites, by the way, of which, of course, Arthur Hughes is one. And so my illustration down the bottom, that's what I wanted to buy, that book, which I can't afford, is showing you the Light Princess floating away. And because she's enchanted, as you know, there's always a way to break an enchantment, and that breaking an enchantment always involves the prince. So the prince comes upon the Light Princess in the forest, and the only way that the Light Princess can stop floating away, because she's got no gravity, is to swim all the time. So here you see the princess swimming. And you can see what I mean about being incredibly pre-Raphaelite, particularly the vision on horseback. You could make some correlations between that and Dürer. The National Gallery is just about to have a very big Dürer exhibition. And obviously, once you see anybody sort of on horseback in this iconic sort of like fashion, you immediately think of Dürer as the Knight, the Death, and the Devil. By the way, they all collected, well, many of the artists like William Morris collected the prints of Albrecht Dürer. I would like this one as well. This is by Dorothy P. Lathrop, who's American in terms of her origins. But all the books that I'm telling you about were immensely popular in America. Again, this just glorious image of the light princess, as you can see, floating away, and a rather Dulac sort of image. You know, Dulac is French, come British. His imagery tends to be Arabian Nights, so there's an obvious Orientalism to the prince, and a rather lovely Oriental palace in the background as he's trying to hold down the light princess. However, the one that I think is the most pre-Raphaelite that Arthur Hughes produces, and many people say this is second only to Tenniel's illustrations of Alice in terms of iconic book illustration in the mid-19th century, is Arthur Hughes's illustrations to MacDonald's At the Back of the North Wind. I mean, look at all that pre-Raphaelite hair. It's absolutely stunning. There are 76 wood engravings after Arthur Hughes illustrating this particular work by MacDonald, which gives you an idea of the investment and the commitment. Investment on the part of the DL brothers, who were the publishers, and commitment on the part of the artist. And when you get later versions of At the Back of the North Wind, it was republished by Blackie, the famous Glasgow publisher. They will often reuse the Arthur Hughes images alongside new ones. So this is the beautiful lady, and I think you'll agree, it looks like Rossetti popped in to design her, particularly her hair. It's a fantastic story, but the imagery, particularly by Arthur Hughes, is then, you know, repeated. So what you'll find is that with these really important, iconic stories that are retold to generation after generation, that the illustrators often look back to what they've gone before and sort of cleverly blend the old and the new together. Jessie Wilcox Smith, another very important American illustrator. Many women take up illustration as a profession around the turn of the century. So, you know, working into the 1920s, in particular into the Art Deco era. So this is, again, I love the way, you know, the boy in the story is in her hair at the back of her neck. And again, all that pre-Raphaelite hair on the right-hand side. And then this is exactly like a really famous pre-Raphaelite painting by Rossetti that lives in the V&A today, where we have Jane, looks very much like Jane Morris, isn't she, here in the tree with a little boy who's gone to the back of the wind. And the Blackie, if you want something to collect, always look out for the publications by Blackie. This is the guy who commissioned Hill House. This is the publisher who commissioned Hill House from Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but the covers are not by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, though they look like they could be, don't they? They are actually by the in-house designer for Blackie, which is Tolwyn Morris, and they are collectible, obviously, in their own right. Right, so EVB, many women often wanted a certain degree of anonymity. You know, they often found themselves seeking gainful employment because their family had fallen on hard times. They didn't necessarily want to blow it from the rooftops, that they were in need of making a living. So quite a few women actually work under a pseudonym, and even more just simply use their initials, EVB. Eleanor Vere Boyle being a good example. This introduces Hans Christian Andersen. These obviously written much earlier, but the illustrated versions don't really come out, not in England anyway, until the 1870s. I'm just showing you Thumbelina, because here again you see an entire world being created by the illustrator, because obviously Thumbelina, you know, reverts to nature. She's tiny and she sort of like goes to live, you know, with the animals, literally. So I love this front cover of her flying in on, I presume it's a swift or a swallow. I am not an ornithologist, you can correct me on that one. And here she is, desolate, because she's woken up and found herself on a lily pad and doesn't quite know how to get back to shore, or what's going to be her fate, having discovered, you know, that she's lost in this other world. Don't worry, she'll find a prince and it'll all end happily ever after.
Oh,
And
definitely.
the Father Tuck's nursery series is to remind you that the pre-Raphaelites enter the nursery, because these books were designed to be read by an adult to a child. They were not cheap. They could sell anywhere between sixpence and a shilling. And so the next generation of artists sort of grew up with the pre-Raphaelites, with Walter Crane perhaps being the best known of the children's book illustrators by the 1870s. However, I couldn't resist showing you my namesake. I am not related to Anne Anderson at all, although I buy a lot of her books for obvious reasons. And she's Scottish, and again, many of her works are published by Blackie and Sons. So The Little Mermaid, you know, a lot of these stories follow a pattern. So The Little Mermaid wants to get legs, come to land and find a princess, famous Disney, obviously film. And The Marsh King's Daughter, well, when she's human, she's horrid, because the Marsh King himself is horrid. But her mother was a wonderful, beautiful princess who was obviously also a very nice person. So the Marsh King's daughter, when she's human, is an absolute bitch. But when she returns back into being a frog, which is her enchantment, then she's really lovely. Don't worry, the end of the story is her being transformed back into a nice princess. There's a rather nasty Rackham tree in the background. Richard Dickey Doyle creates an entire universe of fairies, and again reminds us that fairies don't necessarily have to be nice, that they will often pull the wings off of butterflies or do their best to sabotage a dragonfly. Again, this confection has a narrative to it that came via the poet William Allingham, but he actually had a pretty tough job because he had to write the poem to fit Richard Dickey Doyle's images. The images came first. So this is a bit of a reversal to the normal story of, you know, writer and illustrator. William Allingham had already written a very famous poem about fairies, but he had to sort of, you know, reconceive it for in Fairyland. It has a lovely, it's one of the most beautiful books. It's incredibly expensive. It was, at the time, it was incredibly expensive because it uses the very latest technology, lithography, to produce these stunning coloured images. Chromolithography is what we're talking about here. So the full title, and published in 1875, it was first conceived in 1869. That's why we always have that date. A series of pictures from the elf world. This is the rehearsal in Fairyland, where the elf is teaching all the young birds to sing. Pretty, pretty, pretty. And then there's the sort of plot, which is the fairy prince who falls in love. And you can see here how text and image goes together with that little vignette on the side. You can read it online, but you won't be able to afford to buy it unless you buy a reproduction. This is the triumphal march of the Elf King. And you can see what I mean about the entire universe here that's created. I've always wondered if, you know, the Borrowers comes from Thumbelina, because everything is in miniature, as you can see. I do love that beard just here. Anyway, an entire world that we never see, sort of like beyond our vision. And the last plate is this rather lovely one of them all going to sleep. The dancing elves have all gone to rest. The king and queen have made up, they are friends again, and we all hope that they live happily ever after. I've just got one of these monochrome sheets, which I have framed in my hall. Okay, so here's the next landmark publication, and I really have gone for landmark publications. Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. Yes, now it's very confusing because people think that Rackham illustrated Peter Pan and Wendy. He did not. He illustrated Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, which is about Peter Pan. The names are, well, the Pan part as in mythological figure Pan and his pipes, and Peter, because Peter was one of the Llewellyn Davis children for whom, again, the stories were written. So the stories are actually not bequeathed, but dedicated to Sylvia and Arthur Llewellyn Davis and their boys, because after Sylvia died of cancer and Arthur had already predeceased her, then Rackham basically brought up the boys. Not Rackham, sorry, Barry, J.M. Barry brought up the boys. So you're seeing here Rackham's illustrations to Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, which was first published within another novel, The Little White Bird, in 1902. So in literary terms, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens comes first. So I'm showing you here Peter as a baby being led by the fairies who he wants to play with. We have the top image, the fairies falling out with the birds. They've had a bit of a spat in the story. And then down the bottom, we've got this wonderful image of Rackham and his gnomes and his toadstools. Again, reminding you that fairyland is both pretty and ugly and beautiful, but also dangerous. So here is Peter playing on his pan pipes to entertain all the fairies. They're having a bit of a fairy trot, as you can see. And even more beautiful are the fairies dancing amongst the daisies on the right-hand side. So Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens is, as you can see, actually illustrated by Rackham and published in 1906. So here is Peter Pan, or the boy who wouldn't grow up, or just simply Peter and Wendy, which as a play, 1904, is often said to be the most popular play of the 20th century. I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly it was the most popular play performed between 1900 and the First World War. And the first edition was actually illustrated by Francis Donkin Bedford, who sets the scene. You know, we already have one of the children wearing a top hat, as you can see, and here they are learning to fly. However, I soon discovered when I was doing this, because what you grow up with, isn't it? And I grew up with this version of Peter.
Yes, yes.
I grew up with the Mabel Lucy Atwell version of Peter Pan, published in 1921, and so therefore technically Art Deco. Again, immensely expensive now. So this is when Wendy grew up. She's dusting a mushroom, them flying and being told not to land. I think that's because of the pirates. And then there she is mending his shadow, stitching up. Remember, one of the parts of the story, she has to mend his shadow. And then the front cover is absolutely gorgeous as well, as you can see, designed by maybe Lucy Atwell. And that brings me to my last section, which is bringing us more up to date. So this is Brian Froud's Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell doesn't feature really in the original illustrations by Bedford. She's very much, I'm afraid, a Walt Disney confection. Slightly sexy, as you know, Tinkerbell, from the film Peter Pan. And Brian's version of her she's quite angry, as you can see. So just before we get to Alan Lee and Brian Froud, I just wanted to remind you that there are many more illustrators that I could have shown you. I'm particularly keen on the Robinson family. William Heath is the one that you know, but there are 3 brothers in the family who all illustrate and who create other worlds. I particularly love the Fairies' Birthday. As you know, Heath Robinson, really, he's best known today for his contraptions. I love his Book of Goblins. I can actually afford these, which is a relief. And Alan, working with Brian, begins to create his other world. Also in the late 60s, late 1960s and 1970s. And again, it's just like the Victorian worlds I've been showing you. It's both beautiful and ugly. It is both benign and dangerous. So this is an illustration for E.E. Cummings. This E.E. Cummings has this, he's a famous poet, but he only ever uses lowercase, so you have to write it like that. And this is his Songs of Innocence. Tulips and Chimneys, as you can see, is showing ghosts and goblins and ghouls with potions, hist, whist, little ghost things. And they had this project together called Faeries, published in 1978, which is Brian and Alan working together, where they create an entire other world. And the fairy dance, or the fairy trod, is this idea that fairies enchant you. You dance what you think is the night away, but when you wake up the following morning, you find out you've been dancing for about 7 years. By the way, in all these legends, it's always the mystical number 7. So they just create all these wonderful hobgoblin-y type figures. The brown man of the moors. You know, remember that Brian and Alan removed themselves to Dartmouth, to the wilds of Chagford and Dartmoor, where you can definitely imagine all sorts of beasties living under the rocks. The shellycoat lives in pools of water, and when he moves around, he rattles because he's covered in shells. The Urist, who's in the centre, who I've included because he looks rather like an early version of Gollum. He's a rather sad figure who wants to play with humans, but we all run away because he's so ugly. And then finally, the brown man of the moors sort of lives amongst the rocks. Those are all Alan Lee. They have quite a different style of drawing. So this is Brian Froud. Bluebell Fairy was included in Faeries, as was Toadstools. And as you can see, they were immensely influenced by Rackham. They even have the same, but rather terrifying trees. So we were talking about Richard Dadd whilst we were preparing to get going. And of course, he's one of our most important painters of Fairyland. So Wayland's Smithy here is almost an homage to Richard Dadd's own incredible imagination, which, as you know, led eventually, he escalated down into madness and committed murder and ends up in an insane asylum. So I was recommending to Deborah, one of my friends, who's a great Richard Dadd expert, the fairy fella's masterstroke clearly influenced the Wayland Smithy that you're looking at here. And gnomes much the same. You wouldn't like to meet them on a dark night, would you? Definitely not. Ugly and sinister. And there's no doubt that Brian draws, this is Brian Froud again, draws on a sort of our legacy of Fairyland. So here we have Welcome to Fairyland. But on the other side, the Green Man, you know, there's all that sort of pantheistic pagan folklore that Brian has clearly drawn on over the years. And the Green Man, by the way, is particularly a potent figure down in the peninsula, Devon and Cornwall. The Queen of the Golden Bough is a reference to a very important book. It's called Fraser's Golden Bough. It was an immense collection of folklore and fairy tale that many artists in the late 19th century could turn to for inspiration. And Brian's Good and Bad Fairies of 1998, again, is emphasizing all the time that just like in the real world, there are sinister fairies who are malign, and then there are good fairies. The Queen of the Golden Bough, by the way, is supposed to be a good fairy, though there's a sort of, even quite a sort of dark undercurrent there, because she's a bit of a fertility goddess. She's very pre-Raphaelite, isn't she? Looks like C.R. Ashby designed her necklace and that amazing headdress. Right, so Brian has a great sense of humour. So going to the party, she's got her party dress on, and Gloominous Doom. I love it. I mean, I thought that's quite fit for today at the moment, you know, as every time I turn on the news, I do indeed feel some gloominous doom. And this is the indecision fairy, because obviously they can't decide what to do. And I love the concept of the foot fungus fairy. So he has a lot of fun. I mean, he creates, this is Brian Froud, he's the genius behind Dark Crystal, Labyrinth. So he has created an entire other world, but it's another world that is not devoid of humour. And his wife, Wendy, is equally talented. So they met whilst working for Jim Henson's puppet shop. Wendy actually made Yoda, as in Star Wars. She wasn't allowed to keep him. So she brings Brian's ideas to life 3D in her rather enchanting models, Green Fairy and Forest Garden. And then the last section, the last two sections really, bring us back to Alan Lee. And I could have given you a whole lecture on Alan Lee. I mean, he's won all of the accolades that you can as a book illustrator. He has the Kate Greenaway Prize, and obviously what really made his reputation were the centenary editions of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. They're the centenary for the 100 years since the birth of Tolkien, just in case you're wondering why on earth they were published at the end of the 1990s. So my favourite character is Smaug the dragon. I've got a bit of a thing about dragons, who, as you know, guards the treasure. So just introduce you to some of the most famous characters very quickly. So Gollum obviously first appears in The Hobbit, but he gets darker and more malevolent when we move into the Lord of the Rings. He's a split personality because he's enchanted by the ring. He has a more positive side, and then he has his really hideous side, which is the Gollum. So this is, on the left-hand side is the Gollum in The Hobbit, a la Alan Lee, and as we see him in Lord of the Rings. So I've got the covers next so you can follow. So there's 3 volumes. Again, you can only just about afford these now if you buy all of them. This is Gollum as fully developed by Alan, and he's looking out over from his tree at the Council of Elrond. Luthien is one of the most complex characters in Lord of the Rings. She's said to be based on Edith Tolkien, an equally complex character who was Tolkien's wife. She hated Oxford, she hated academia, and she made Tolkien spend most of their summers in Bournemouth, which is why most of Lord of the Rings was written in the Miramar Hotel, which is immediately behind the Russell Coates.
Good gosh, gracious.
Which is why I would very much like to have an Alan Lee Lord of the Rings show in Bournemouth. I'll get there one year. Anyway, she's a spin-off, is Luthien. She has stories of her own. She's actually one of the oldest. She's sort of like from a prequel. She appears in a prequel. So, and so here we've got an illustration featuring Luthien. She's on the Bridge of Woe, in mantle wrapped at dead of night. She sat and sang, and I think she's this figure here, right at the end of the bridge. Right, I'm gonna speed up because I'm coming to the end. So this is from the Fellowship of the Ring, and you know, it's Kate Blanchett played this character, and it's amazing how close to the films Alan's illustrations are. And the reason for that is that Jackson said when he was planning Lord of the Rings, I want it to look just like an illustration by Alan Lee. So the next obvious step was to get Alan Lee to design all of the sets for not only Lord of the Rings, but also The Hobbit. So I think altogether he spent about 12 years. If you add it all up, he spent about 12 years in New Zealand. So here are the Ents. They are in the 2 towers, but most importantly, you can see how they were clearly inspired by Rackham, and also are a reworking of one of his fairy themes. So the image at the top is actually a pre-Ent as imagined by Alan Lee in his 1978 book Faeries. And then it's all about battles, isn't it? So the 2 towers here, Helm's Deep. What I'm hoping that Tim recognises this, because we had it in Castles, the exhibition that he staged. In fact, we had quite a few works, in fact, by Alan in Castles. And the Lord of the Rings, the last volume, The Return of the King, also seems to be dominated by battles. So here's the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and then the other illustration shows what's reminds me of Hannibal crossing the Alps. You can just see the elephant in the background, and then here he is in close-up, one of Alan's most dramatic images. But to finish, well, it's the crossover between book illustration and film. So the sketchbook shows some of Alan's conceptions for the film, like the large battering ram known as Grond, and these were all published in Lord of the Rings, the sketchbook. Yes, they spin off everything. And clearly when you come to see Game of Thrones, which hopefully some of you have, you can see some very obvious correlations between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. So this is the Battle of the Bastards. These are all conceived by Kieran Belshaw, who we finished our exhibition with. Really hideous, as you can see, moment in the story where they're all going to die. The beautiful ships of Daenerys Targaryen were evidently inspired by the Black Ships Before Troy, which is an illustrated book by Alan Lee, which I haven't shown you because it's not a fairy tale. It's actually a reworking, Rosemary Sutcliffe, her famous reworking of The Fall of Troy. But this was one of the most important projects that Alan Lee worked on, and how he got his Kate Greenaway medal, his illustrations for Black Ships Before Troy, which then inspired Kieran Belshaw. So I'm showing you how they all know each other's work, how one generation learns from the one before, nothing changes, and how you reinterpret those works for the future. I love these because they look like Viking ships. And I have a thing about dragons. So this is the dragon pit, and this is the homeland of Daenerys Targaryen in the background, with the giant portal based, you know, on the dragon's heads. First of all, I'd just like to point out that I have my own webpage. So that's anne-anderson.com, where you will find I post lots of interesting things, mostly about Art Nouveau, because my book was published. As you can see, I'm very proud of the front cover. It was published in November. You'll find this on my Amazon page, along with my other books on the Pre-Raphaelites, and also the guidebook to the Perseus series. And if you want something to cheer you up during February, again, I've got information about this on my webpage. Well, I will do shortly. Working with alongside the Art Society to keep us all sane, I'm doing a series of morning lectures throughout February, Wednesday morning at 11, on my favourite characters, William Morris, Christopher Dresser, Ernest Jimson and Victor Horta. And again, if you want to find out more about that, you can either email me or you can go to my webpage. That's anne-anderson.com. Right, and then just my very last slide, which will make you feel queasy. I found this GIF of Alice going down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to leave you with that, as that really is quite alarming, isn't it? But hopefully you've enjoyed going down the rabbit hole with me this morning.